All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Authors at Google series with a special welcome to our audience from YouTube and C-SPAN's Book TV today. It's our pleasure to welcome Richard Florida to talk about his new book, Who's Your City? How the Creative Economy is Making the Place You Live the Most Important Decision of Your Life. In the book, Richard stresses that the choice of where to live is not as arbitrary as some might imagine. The question of place is in fact becoming more and more relevant to the global economy and to our individual lives, and to the extent that it's even as important a choice as, say, one's career or one's spouse. To give you a bit of background, Richard is professor of business and creativity at the Rotman School of Management in the University of Toronto. He's also taught at Harvard and MIT, among numerous other places. In addition, he's also the author of two national bestsellers, The Rise of the Creative Class and The Flight of the Creative Class, and his ideas on the creative class have helped change the way we think about global economy and commercial innovation. We're very glad to have him here today to share some of his insights, and Richard will save time at the end of his talk for questions. As a quick reminder, if you could please use the microphone if you have any questions or comments during the talk. This way we can be sure to capture this on C-SPAN and YouTube. It would be much appreciated. With that, let's please give a warm welcome to Richard to Google today.
I'll use the stage for the cameras. Thank you all for coming out. I'll talk for about 40 or 45 minutes, especially since this is being taped for YouTube and C-SPAN. And then we'll have time for questions, and even I can probably take some questions after that offline if you like. That was a terrific introduction, and it's really wonderful for us to be out here today. My first book, which wasn't mentioned, was written in 1990, and it was all about the rise of Silicon Valley. And I've been coming out, it was called The Breakthrough Illusion. And I've been coming out here and studying and working in the Valley for a long, long time. And then I wrote The Rise of the Creative Class and The Flight of Creative Class, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about them, but the main thing I want to talk about today is this new book, Who's Your City? And, you know, I've been a professor now for a couple decades, actually since 1984, so the better part of 2 decades. And I took my PhD in urban planning. And so I've studied cities and regions and places for a long, long time. And I've written books about that, and mayors have read the books and talked about them, and economic development officials have talked about them, and even real estate developers have found this to be interesting, and people who study cities. But the one thing that struck me, and I've moved 2 times. My wife and I have moved 2 times in the past 5 or 6 years. We moved from Pittsburgh, where I taught at Carnegie Mellon for nearly 20 years. I'm sure some of you are from Carnegie Mellon, or some of your colleagues are from Carnegie Mellon. And then we moved from Washington, D.C. to Toronto. So I began to think about why people move and how we pick the cities we locate in. And then I had a whole bunch of students who, after graduating from places like Carnegie Mellon, were trying to figure out where they wanted to move and how they wanted to organize their lives and their careers and balance that choice. And one day it dawned on me. And this is sort of how it came into my mind. When I was a little kid, and I grew up in New Jersey, my dad worked in a factory. He only had an 8th grade education. And he would say to me, Rich, you have to study hard. You have to get good grades. You have to go to college or university because you need to get a good job. And you know, at that time, even when I was young, they had all these stories in like magazines and papers about interesting fields to go into. And then when I went to high school, we had this guidance counselor who tried to give you advice, and he told me I'd probably never make it. There was only 1 or 2 kids in our Catholic high school who had the ability, but that just motivated me a little harder. And as I got older, I could see that there was all of this advice about what to do about your job and your career and how important that was, and some of it, you know, quite rudimentary, and it might be on television talk shows. And then I thought about my mom, who was a quite sensible woman. And she always said, well, Richard, you need to study hard and get good grades, but realize picking your life, you know, your mate, I don't think we had the word life partner then, picking the woman you marry, which is what my mom would have said, is really, really important because I married your dad. He only had an 8th grade education. He worked really hard in a factory, but for the 40 plus years, nearly 50 years we were married, I was just fantastically happy. It was the greatest decision I made, and we had a family. And then, you know, I know enough about psychology to know that there's a whole, and I'll talk a little bit about this, a whole industry of studies about happiness. And those studies about happiness say, our jobs and our careers can fulfill us, but our social relationships and our family and our children and the friends we have are a key part of what make us have happy and fulfilled lives. And then it dawned on me. So we talk a lot about, and then I read Dan Gilbert's book, and I think Dan gave a talk here. I think I saw it on your, and Dan Gilbert's book, Stumbling on Happiness. And he said, there are 3 big decisions you make in your life that are really important in determining your future and your happiness. Where to live, what to do, and whom to do it with. And the whole book is focused on the what to do and who to do it with. And then I looked, and I found all these books, from academic tomes to self-help books on careers. The same thing I felt, everything from works of psychology to like Dear Abby and Ann Landers on relationships. And no one had ever written a book about why the place we choose to live is important. And I thought, well, I've been studying this stuff for 25 years. I should do it. So that was about 2 years ago. And I had already done 20 plus years of research on places. So that's what I want to tell you about. Why this decision that we make where to live is one of the 3 most decisions we make in our lives. And in many ways, and if you think about your own decision to live in this area, in many ways, it's the most important. And that's kind of a strong statement, and I want to make that point. But in fact, increasingly, the place we choose to live is not only one of these 3 legs of a triangle, what we do, our jobs and careers, who we marry, our social lives, our relationships, the place we live. In fact, it conditions the other 2. Because increasingly, the job and career markets we participate in, and as we'll talk about, the mating markets, right, that we are in, where we meet each other, really differ dramatically by place. So there's 3 big parts of the book. The first part of the book says why place matters. The second, in general, I'll talk about that. The second part of the book says why it's important to you from a career and jobs perspective. And the third part of the book, which is also, I think, very interesting, talks about why place is important to your life beyond your career and your jobs. And in fact, it says that we make 3 big decisions about location in our lives that are really, really important. 40 million of us, and we just looked at the new census data, it may be as many as 50 million Americans move every year. So this is a non-trivial number. 15 million of us, and as many as 20 million of us, make a significant move, like most of you made. We're moving out of the county that we currently live in. We're moving from one county to another county. We're moving to another state, or we're moving abroad. That is a huge number, and a minority of our moves are for work. At best, a fifth to a quarter, 20 to 25% of our moves are for work. There are other factors that matter. Now think about this. This is occurring just at the time, if you read the newspaper, Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, San Jose Mercury News, New York Times, and if you read academic work, you read the business press, well, you guys do technology, you know this. This is happening at exactly the time when most people would say place and location are supposed to become less important. The rise of wireless, technology, advances in transport, and communication are supposed to make us much more locationally flexible. We can work from a mountaintop in the Rockies. We can work from a ski chalet. We can work from a beach house, in San Diego or in the south of France. There are 6 billion people, supposedly, that are competing with us. We've seen the articles. And not just now. Over the course of the 20th century, first it was supposed to be the telegraph and the railroad, and then the telephone and the automobile, then the airplane, and now wireless, the computer, and the internet. These were supposed to free us from the constraints of location. Distance is dead. Place is no longer important. And then the most eloquent statement of this, Tom Friedman's fantastic book, The World is Flat. In this new world we live in, the world has become flat. Distance is no longer important. Place no longer matters. You can plug and play from anywhere. In fact, Friedman says in that book, in order to innovate in today's world, you no longer have to emigrate. It's a classic quote in that book. So all these advances in technology are freeing us from the constraints of place. Therefore, location shouldn't be as important, and we should spread out. Well, anyway, being a professor for 25 years, studying at Rutgers and then MIT and Columbia and Carnegie Mellon and now at the University of Toronto, I care something about actual empirical data. So we said, why not take a look at this? Is this true? Is it true that people are becoming more geographically spread out? That's the first part of the book. This year, last year, 2007, is the first year in human history. It's a great milestone. More than 50% of all people on the earth live in urban areas, according to the United Nations. And population is one thing. And if you look around the world and you look at populations, you'll note that we have generated these large, very broad-scale megacities, 5, 10, 20, 30 million in population. Well, there's no place in the world that collects data on not just where people live. You can collect what cities people live in. No place in the world, and you would think the World Bank would have this, or the United Nations would have this, or some interesting consulting firm would have this, but they don't. No one collects data on where economic activity or innovation occurs outside of their nation. So you can get data on the 191 member nations of the United Nations, but you can't get it on a smaller scale. So what I did was partner with a young fellow at the University of Maryland. He's a research scientist there. His name's Tim Goulden. He's reasonably good in computer science. He's a whiz at GIS, Geographic Information Systems. And what we did to get a handle on this is we took a very simple solution. We took the satellite images of the world at night. And we said, what those images are really images of energy emission. And Tim invented a series of statistical programs that would derive economic activity. We call it light-related product. And we compared it within countries to existing statistics on regional economic activity for the United States, for Europe, for Canada. But then we use that basic metric to show the distribution of economic activity for the whole world. Second thing we did is we went out, because you could get data on where inventors live in the United States from the Patent and Trademark Office, we went out and actually identified the location of inventors who make patents, and then used the World Intellectual Property Organization statistics to condition them for the entire world. And finally, a wonderful professor named Michael Batty had information on where scientific discoveries are made and where co-authors of papers live, and we used that data. So we had data on population, economic activity, patented innovations, a rudimentary measure of innovation. You could do better, perhaps, but it was available, and then scientific discovery. When you look at that data, when you go from population to economic activity to innovation to scientific discovery, the locations become increasingly concentrated. The world isn't flat. In fact, we said, I have a chapter devoted to this, the world is incredibly concentrated or spiky. Globalization has two sides. At the same time that technology and trade and advances in communication allow us to distribute economic activity over a broader world map, or over the globe, the landscape of the world, it's also occurring in a very concentrated way. So it's kind of a dialectic. The globalization is occurring in a way that both is decentralizing but concentrating at the same time. Here's what we figured out. If you take, what is driving the world is no longer nation states. And it's no longer just cities. If you really look at those images, and if you're looking on your computer, you can just click on who'syourcity.com. Who'syourcity.com has all of these maps up and running, and you can look at them. They're very in the satellite images and so on and so forth. So they're right there if you'd like to take a glance. But what we found is that out of these 191 nations, there are 40 mega regions that drive the world economy. The Boston, New York, Washington corridor. The Northern California, San Francisco Bay Area. Southern California. Chi Pitts, the region that runs really from Chicago a little bit west over to Minneapolis, through Detroit, Cleveland, down to Pittsburgh. These are easily viewable on the satellite images of the world at night. Greater Tokyo, Greater London, Brus-Twerp. And we have some kind of names, Amsterdam, Brussels, Antwerp. 40 of them. These regions, these 40 regions, which contain about 18% of the world's population, account for more than 2/3 of all the economic activity in the world, and roughly 9 in 10 of all innovations. If you want to innovate, you certainly have to emigrate. There are only about a half dozen places in the world, like this one in the Silicon Valley, which compete at the cutting edge of innovation. Well, that's the big picture. And from that big picture, we try in the book to move down to how that will affect you and how the nature of this economically concentrated place, organized, spiky world, organized mega regions, will affect your life. The first thing that we found that is quite self-evident to folks in this room at Google in Silicon Valley is that job markets themselves are becoming increasingly geographically concentrated. The Silicon Valley is perhaps the best example. If you want to work at the frontiers of software engineering or semiconductors, increasingly biotechnology, alternative energy, and you want to work at that frontier of that field, there's only really one place to be. Maybe there's a couple of others, but at the absolute frontier, there's only one place to be. If you want to work in investment banking, it's New York and London and maybe Hong Kong and several other places. If you want to be in more and more careers, there's a couple of exceptions. Education and healthcare are more ubiquitously spread out. But more and more careers in technology, in banking, in finance, in the processions. But what really got interesting to me, and it's a long-term interest, as much as I'm interested in understanding where folks like you, technology-based people, locate and companies cluster, I also found it to be very interesting to start to look at where other kinds of creative people, artistically creative people, locate. And I have a long-running interest in music. So one of the questions the book poses is why would Jack White, founder of the White Stripes, a band that has reinvented contemporary sound and is quite successful, that comes from the greater Detroit area and that incredible incubator of musical innovations, and not just Motown, right? Iggy Pop and the Stooges, the MC5, techno. Why would Jack White up and move and sell his home in Detroit and relocate to Nashville? Now think about this. Musicians should be able to, because it's not like a factory. It's not like an assembly line. It's not like there's a lot of capital requirement. It's not like you need to be near a port. If you're a musician, you should be able to locate anywhere you want. You should be able to, if you're successful, stay in Detroit and play your music, or in the Bay Area, wherever you are. Moreover, if anything, you would think a musician would be drawn to a market. Nashville is a lovely place, but it's not a large-scale market. Maybe you could say Los Angeles is a large-scale market. Maybe you can say New York area is a large-scale market. Maybe you can say London is. But Nashville? Well, we did the research with several of my students, and we calculated where musicians would locate, where musical industry companies would locate. Nashville's rise from the year 1970 to the year 2000 sucked up all the growth in the music industry. Over that period of time, Nashville, along with New York and Los Angeles, became a preponderant center for musicians who have no physical constraints, not tied to ports, not tied to factories, not tied to capital investment, not even tied to the kinds of facilities you would be tied to in doing technology in Silicon Valley. Why? In fact, the location of musicians is as concentrated or more concentrated than the location, and I kind of look at musicians, in addition to technology people, as kind of fruit flies for understanding these location trends in our new creative economy. Why? Why would this be so? Why would economic activity that is not physically constrained concentrate? Why wouldn't the world, just to use Robert Lucas, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, why wouldn't the world just fly apart? What is causing us to concentrate? There's a brilliant woman. She passed away 2 years ago. She was my idol and my mentor. Her name is Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs didn't have a PhD. She never took a university appointment. She lived in New York City, where she wrote a remarkable book on her neighborhood, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Then moved to Toronto, where she raised her family and wrote several more remarkable books, including two, one called The Economy of Cities and one called Cities and the Wealth of Nations. Jane solved the puzzle of economic growth, understanding cities as complex economic systems. When Robert Lucas from the University of Chicago won his Nobel Prize, he said that Jane deserved a Nobel Prize for this insight. She said, it's not specialization of the sort that Adam Smith identified that drives economic growth. It's important when companies specialize and create a division of labor. It's not just innovation that Joseph Schumpeter talked about, these great waves of creative destruction that power economies, that shape economic growth. It's certainly not nation states that David Ricardo talked about in his classic theory of comparative advantage, where nations come to specialize and trade and grow wealth. She said it's cities and mega regions that drive economic growth. Not because companies locate there, not because raw materials and resources are there, but because we're there. Why cities grow, and think about Google and this company and your life and this valley. When talented and creative people come together, she argued, we increase each other's productivity. By working together in teams and locating together in communities, this is where our own productivity and efficiency grows. I called this the clustering force. It's the force that comes from human beings co-located together, not enhancing our own individual productivities, enhancing our social or community, intersubjective, collective productivity. And she said one other thing. And she has a classic study in her book. This was before the time of technology. She studied the woman who invented the brassiere. It's such an interesting example. And what she said was, here was a woman who realized the need for this new kind of garment. And what she did was combine inputs and insights of people around her. So it is obvious in music, it is obvious in art, it's obvious in design, it's obvious in technology how we need each other. But in these simpler times, in these older scale industries, she argued, it was equally important. Where innovation comes from, she said, is not companies per se. It's from the city or the community, because companies tend to specialize. It's the city which has the diversity of people, the diversity of lifestyles. And Scott Page, in his brilliant book on diversity, said, if you want to know where innovation comes from, you have to understand cognitive diversity. And that cognitive diversity is critical, different thinking styles, critical for innovation. But he went one step farther. He said, if you want an easy route to cognitive diversity, one quick way there is demographic diversity. If you have people who different ethnically, by nationality, by place of birth, there's a high rate of migration, both genders, different sexual orientations, all age groups, chances are you're going to get more cognitive diversity in that stew. That's the root of the clustering force. So all of this is important to our economy. All of it is important to driving economic growth. Our economy is becoming more concentrated, more organized around these giant mega regions. And in fact, these mega regions, not nation states, are what drive economic growth. The second part of the book talks about why this matters in addition to just the economic drivers. I run a little website at creativeclass.com. It gets a few hits until one day I posted the singles map. The singles map was a map of America with red dots for where the boys have the good odds and blue dots for where the women have the good odds. So the red dots would mean there were more single women than men. The blue dots would mean there were more single men than women. In New York City, the greater New York area, there are 210,000 more single women than men. In greater Los Angeles, there are 90,000 more single men than women. In the Bay Area, there are 65,000. In the Bay Area, which you take the Valley in San Francisco, 65,000 more single men than single women. And what the book says in terms of picking a place, if you really think about your life, what's going to have more impact on it in the early phases of your life? Is it going to be getting your career right? Is it going to be my dad's question, getting your career and job right? Or is it going to be finding the right life partner? Now, I don't make a value judgment, but many people would say finding the right life partner or significant other is at least as important as finding the right job and career. And what the book says is if you're thinking about where to locate, your odds are very different of finding that it's not only the labor market that matters. We coined a silly term. It's the mating market that can have a big influence. It's the mating market that you're in. And my wife, Rana, and I often talk about this. We met in Detroit, by the way, where the odds are clearly stacked in my favor, big time. There are many, many more single women than men, so I was very lucky, even though I didn't know it at the time. But we talk about this in advising our friends and relatives about where they should go locate, and often talk to them more about their love life than their economic life. Where should I go to meet that right gal or guy? Well, anyway, in the book, we figured out that there are really 3 big location decisions that you make. 3 critical times in your life that you're really likely to think about moving and to move. The first one, which we think is the most important, is what you do after college. That move after college, I have come to believe, and I'll make an extreme statement, is as important, if not more important, than where you go to university. That positioning yourself after college in the right labor market, career market, mating market is critical to your life trajectory. And get this, the average person in their 20s, actually about 1/3 of all people in their 20s move every year. The average person in our 20s is 3.5 times more likely to move than a 40-year-old, and 5 to 7 times more likely to move than a 50-year-old. So the high rates of mobility in our life come after college when we're looking for that place that's the right fit. The second big move in our life comes not when we get married, but when we have kids. And what the book says there is, obviously the temptation when you have kids, for many people, is to move out of their kind of city shared apartment or condo, to begin to think about schools and crime rate, and to move 10 miles east or west, north or south to a nice suburb. My brother's going through this. He lives in Hoboken, New Jersey. They live in a wonderful apartment. They have 3 kids, and he's kind of thinking, well, where do we go? Do we go to a suburb of New Jersey? And my point in the book is, you may end up in a place in a 50-mile band around your house, but you owe it to yourself to think about this long and hard. You owe it to yourself to think about what alternative locations, and the book has a list, and it has some tools. We call our tool the Place Finder, and it enables you, it's a decision support tool, to put in places that you might think you want to live and get a crude evaluation of them. But you owe it to yourself to think about this and think about the mix of factors that matter in crime, schools, affordable housing. The third big move comes when your kids leave the house and you're an empty nester. When I initially wrote the book, my goal was that moms and dad would buy this book for kids when they graduate college, right? Because I'm a college professor, and they give it to their son and daughter and say, think about where you're going to locate. It's as important as your job or career. I'm going to help you. You know what my real goal is? That you guys buy it for your parents. That young people graduating college, watching their folks try to grapple with this decision, say, no, you, mom and dad, probably most moms and dads today are part of the baby boom era. There's a large number of them. They're a large storehouse of wealth. That you, mom and dad, have the ability to make a decision about where a place is going to best fit you. Well, anyway, in one of the first interviews I did for the book, I was talking to this lovely young woman, and without me bringing this up, she said, my in-laws just moved. And I had created all these measures of vibrancy of a place, a bohemian index where artists and musicians and culturally creative people live. I had created, in my previous work, a gay index, arguing that places that have large gay and lesbian populations that are open-minded will also have these characteristics that lead to innovation. She said, well, my in-laws wanted to go to a place that had fresh mozzarella. Think about her mozzarella index, what that is a proximate measure for. A place that has fresh mozzarella on a daily basis is the kind of place that will have many other amenities, lifestyle choices, interesting people around. Well, anyway, what we found in breaking this down is that in the United States, we are generating not just an economic class divide, but a geographic class divide. That, in fact, in the past, when most of us were growing up, certainly when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, whether you lived in New York or New Jersey, California, Michigan, Illinois, there was an almost equal mix of college graduates, post-college graduates, high school graduates, and high school dropouts. Now, if you look at the map of America, what we find is that we're sorting and segregating by skill level and education. Young, talented, high-skill people in the United States and around the world are sorting themselves into a couple handful of economic regions. I call this the means migration or the brain migration. And in the book, I took this a little further. I said, if you want to be socioeconomically mobile today, if you want to move up the economic ladder, it increasingly requires geographic mobility. The world isn't flat at all. The world is incredibly concentrated, and people have to move to the areas of economic and social opportunity. In fact, in the book, I identify a new class divide, which is not rich and poor, capitalist and worker. There's the mobile, the fortunate like us in this room, who decide that we will move not only between states, but across oceans, as so many of us do, to find opportunity. There are the rooted. My grandparents moved from Italy. They were mobile. My parents moved to New Jersey, and they never moved from the suburban house they bought in 1960. They lived there their entire life. And the rooted people make a trade-off, and it's a very important trade-off, and it's one we have to realize. They value family and friends over economic mobility. By the way, this is important for you guys to know. There's an economist in England who actually studied this, and he did fairly detailed studies. I always get in arguments when I bring up this study. It's not my study. He calculated the social loss, the psychic income loss we take on from leaving family, brothers and sisters, siblings, and friends behind. His calculation that it is a minimum of $100,000 for each person. I'm not saying I agree with his calculation that they may be worth much, much more than that, but at least he gives us a mechanism to think about this. So people who are rooted trade off in favor of being close to families and friends and against economic opportunity. And then the third class, which is quite tragic, are the stuck. People who either don't have the economic resources, the social resources, whose houses have gone underwater in the mortgage and credit crunch, and don't have the ability to move. And in thinking about the class structure of the global economy, this becomes a very useful way to analyze the world between those who are mobile, who may not have a lot of resources to begin with, but can become mobile, or families enable them to do that, the rooted and the stuck. Well, the book talks about real estate and why different real estate markets perform as they do and career options. But I want to spend a few minutes because one of the things I learned in writing this book and in doing the research is that too much of our own framework, too much of my own work, to be quite honest, was conditioned by economics in a business perspective about careers and jobs and the concentration of economic activity. Well, when I was studying these migration decisions, these decisions to move, talking to my students, talking to folks like you, people gave me an interesting answer when I asked them, why do you want to move to a certain location? What draws you to a certain location? And I heard this today from somebody I was talking to. They said, I want to move to a place that has energy, that gives me energy. So I'm an economist, economic geographer. When we think of energy, we think of things like gasoline and electric prices and all of this other stuff. Anyway, I was invited to interact with a group of psychologists, and I kind of introduced my talk with that theme. When people I ask if they're going to move, they say they want to move to a place that has opportunity and energy. I can't wrap my hands around this construct of energy. I think too much in terms of economics, the cost of oil and gas and powering a car and fueling a home. Afterwards, I had a remarkable meeting with 3 or 4 of the greatest positive psychologists in the world. We began to think about this, and they said, this is absolutely right. This category of energy is critical, but you have to begin to think about the things that give people energy. What informs our psyche? Well, I began to think about this, and I began to noodle it around, and I learned from them that there is a school of psychology called personality psychology. And that school of psychology says there are 5 factors of personality. There are 5 types of people. There are agreeable people. They get along with others. There's conscientious people. They work very hard. They're dutiful. They do their tasks. There's extroverted people. Lots of them are in sales jobs. They like to meet other people, and they're very good at getting along. There's neurotic people, and there's open to experience people. Open to experience people are the kinds of people that most traditional corporations have shunned. They tend to be a little bit outside the norm, a little bit iconoclastic. They tend not to like to take orders. They can be kind of aloof and disagreeable. Maybe some of you have met people like that in your life. They tend to be highly creative, highly innovative, prone to migration, and the folks who will not stay working in a company but create their own company. Well, while I'm beginning to ponder this and think about this, I read on a blog that there was this young psychologist who figured out that he could look at your iTunes list and read your personality perfectly. He could go to your dorm room if you were in college and look at your dorm room and perfectly read whether you are agreeable, conscientious, extrovert, open to experience, neurotic. I sent him a note. I said, have you ever thought about looking at location? Do these personality types, not just by education, college-age people live in San Francisco or college-educated people live in San Francisco or Washington, D.C. or Boston. Have you ever thought about looking at where the personality types are? Those maps are also at whoisyourcity.com. He had a sample of 650,000 people. He said, well, Rich, we could identify their precise location, almost their address, and certainly their zip code. Working with my team at the Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto, we mapped them. And what comes out so clearly on that map is, you know, conscientious people are kind of around Michigan and Ohio and that old industrial belt where you think about it. People had to work hard and climb the corporate ladder. Agreeable people are a little bit south, you know, into the Sun Belt and down into Atlanta and down into Florida. The extroverts are like tons of them in Chicago. Few in Atlanta. And Chicago, by the way, if Silicon Valley is the center of technology, you know what Chicago's two leading occupations are? Salesperson and flight attendant. And lots of extroverts in Chicago. No kidding, you can see the map. We have the map in the book of those occupations based on location quotients. Where are the open to experience people? If the other ones are almost like big blobs where they're kind of growing larger, the open to experience people are like pinpoints. In a way, some of it looks like the location of Google facilities. There's New York. There's Boston. Washington, D.C., a few in southern Florida, Austin, bing, 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 Austin, a few in Denver, Seattle, Portland, huge mass around San Francisco and L.A. Why would this be? We don't have enough information to track this. We're going to build it over time. But what we believe is that open to experience people are not only the most innovative and creative, we are the most likely people to migrate. And it's not like we're searching around and saying, well, where are other open to experience people like me? We're making location decisions. And sooner or later, we find our way, whether that's the East Village in New York or Williamsburg, Brooklyn, or the East Bay or the Silicon Valley or West Hollywood or Adams Morgan in Washington, D.C., open to experience people cluster. And when I figured that out, I thought, now I can understand what's different about the area around Stanford than the area around Carnegie Mellon, where I taught. My students were incredibly brilliant. The ability to invent new things was incredibly dramatic. Think about your own founders. Think about where you come from. Think about the founders of other tech companies. It wasn't just that Stanford is in the Valley. What did one great venture capitalist say about the Valley? Take and he was making a joke, take one great research university, add venture capital, shake vigorously if you want to replicate it. It was this additional dimension of psychology, that there were certain places with great universities and certain places that had technology but could also attract, and then I understood the Bay Area. There was a cluster of arts and creativity. Remember, the Grateful Dead got its start in Palo Alto, not San Francisco. Remember, Ken Kesey was based in this part of the Bay Area. Music, culture, creativity, writing, a large gay and lesbian population, cultural change, and technological innovation could be related to the same thing. A place that attracts this very unique, open to experience population and allows them to flourish. And then we did one last thing in the book. We weren't satisfied there. We went out with the Gallup organization and we conducted a survey. We surveyed 28,000 people about what makes us happy in our lives. We added questions about place as well as job and career and family and friends. And then we asked people specific questions about their place. We found two things that are really quite interesting. The first thing we found is when we really probe human happiness and well-being and how fulfilled we will be in our life, family and friends and social relationships are critical. Money matters, but not nearly very much. What matters is we have a job that we love, that we are allowed to be ourselves. Self-expression is so critical, that we can self-express in our work from the way we dress to the way we think to the way we want to imagine our futures. That we have control of our lives and flexibility. We don't have to be one person at work and one person at home. Our social relationships are key. The love of our family and friends, those matter tremendously. But place was as important as the other two. It was the missing link, I argue, in Hoosier City, in happiness and social well-being studies. In fact, when we asked people where stress comes from in our lives, you know what people told us? We get a lot of joy, but a lot of stress from our job. We get a lot of joy, but a lot of stress from our families. Only 3% of our sample survey said that the place they live is a source of stress. And so one of our arguments in the book is that the place we live is an incredible stress reliever. That whether we're cyclists or runners, or we like to just walk around the block, or perhaps go shopping, or we surf, or whatever we do, whatever our hobby is in our place, it somehow is a stress relief valve in these 24/7, always-on times we live. The second thing we found is that when we think about place, we need to revise our framework. After I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, a number of urban experts, specialists, professors, journalists engaged me in a debate. When they looked at my findings on how places that were open to gay and lesbian people, places that had a higher cultural creativity quotient, a larger bohemian factor, that had better living conditions, that were more exciting and had more energy, and they said, Florida's made a terrible mistake. They said, does he really believe, this is the truth, they said, does he really believe that the nexus of economic growth turns on places that can attract, their words, yuppies, sophistos, trendoids, and gays? Can't be true. Another fellow said, and I'm married, Florida, we know his true purpose. 25 years of work on economic growth. He has a gay agenda. He's leading the gay agenda. Another one said he wants to undermine family values. And a fourth said his goal is to criticize Judeo-Christian civilization as we currently know it. So we undertook this survey with great care with the Gallup organization to get at this. Not only what grows our economies, what gives us true happiness and well-being in our lives based on our communities. We asked about basic services, crime rates, school systems, safety. We asked about job opportunities, career networks, social options, the ability to meet different people and make friends. We asked about the quality of the place. Does it have trees and parks and sunshine and good weather? Does it care about its architecture? Does it invest in its arts and culture? How does it treat its people? We found that there are 5 factors that matter. And it's not just one. All 5 factors are key to having a happy relationship and a positive experience and being fulfilled in your community. And you should think about this in your own life. The first thing we found is that there's some basics you have to just do right. You have to have decent school systems. You have to have decent policing. You have to get the basics right. You have to have some level of economic opportunity, and we talked about how those differ by places. But you have to have some level of economic opportunity, and people have to be able to do things they really want to do. People are a lot happier when they believe in the mayor. They believe in the business community. They believe that they can participate. When in communities where we not only kind of think our leadership is good, but we feel we have valves and vehicles to participate at some level and connect, we're happier. Now, most people would agree with that. But we found 2 additional factors add a heck of a lot to our happiness and well-being in our community. Not just for the affluent among us. Not just for the creative class. Not just for yuppies. This is for every racial and ethnic income and work and job group. One of the most important factors, as important as low crime and good schools, is how open to diversity the community is. We asked, is your community a good place for senior citizens, disabled people, ethnic and religious minorities, young people looking for jobs, recent college graduates, moms and dads raising families, gay and lesbian people? Community happiness rose appreciably and significantly in those communities where the preponderance of residents said, my town is a good place for all of those groups. Two groups came out lowest on the list. And I think this explains a lot about the places that grow in the world and don't. The lowest ranked group, understandably, was the poor. Many people believed that their communities were not a good place for the poor. Now, you might think the next group might be ethnic and religious minorities, racial minorities, gays and lesbians. Nope. Recent college graduates looking for a job. And that explains to me a lot about why only a small number of places in this country and around the world are net attractors of college graduates. The top ranked factor, I call it quality of place. Number one, ahead of crime, security, education, all the other factors, was the quality of the place itself. Not just sunshine. Trees, parks, outdoor recreation, the historic architecture, a sense of the city that preserves its natural environment and its built environment, that has a real soul. And you know, the more I thought about this, the more it made sense. Time immemorial, when we lived in caves, when we lived in rudimentary cities, we were decorating those caves and building aesthetic tributes in our cities, and it makes sense. And think about your own life, where you've lived. Places that you can resonate with, that take pride in their appearance, that have aesthetic beauty, that have this quality of place. This isn't a frivolity, this book argues, that making a decision, crime rates, school systems, mayor's competence, absolutely. But looking at how open-minded and diverse and inclusive a community is, and looking at it, how it cares for itself, how aesthetic it is a critical not only in your own judgment, but in how happy a preponderance of our survey respondents would be. Anyway, the main point of the book is simple. You know about how important your job and your work is. People have told you that. You know how important it is to find the right significant other. At least people offer you advice. What the book is saying is not that there is a single best place. And by the way, if you look at the lists, overall, this Bay Area, San Francisco, scores highly. The Valley, San Francisco, and the surrounding area score highly across the board. And that may be right for many people. It may even be a better place than most others. But the book is saying something different. Just like the old adage is, everybody has a different skill and a different aptitude and a different job and a different thing they have to offer the world. Or, better yet, just like there's another person, just like there's a significant other or life partner for everyone, what the book is really saying, and why we built our Place Finder and why we built these tools, is not to say there's one best kind of place, but that the most important thing is that people think about it, they pay attention to it, that you give it a fraction of the attention you do to your job and your career and your life partner, and that most importantly, if we find the place that fits us, we're likely not only to be much more economically successful, most of all, if we find that place that fits, it's almost like having a good marriage or a good partnership versus a bad marriage ending in divorce. If we find that place that fits, we're likely to be a whole lot happier and have a lot more satisfaction and well-being in our lives. Thanks for listening, and since C-SPAN and YouTube are taping, we just urge you, if you have a question, to please use the microphone. Thank you, guys. Very kind. Do you have a question?
Excuse me, I guess I'm in the prime position here. From a personal level, I've lived in the Bay Area about a year and a half. I moved from Mexico City, where I was living for 2 years, and I've lived in Boston and Washington, D.C., and the quality of my life, not only because I'm now working at Google and all of these other things, just seems so much better, even though I'm working harder, I'm working longer hours, I have a longer commute, and those sorts of things, and I'm living actually in the city. So to kind of hear what you're saying as a personal validation is really great, but what I guess I would ask as a question is, how do you account for, values in personal decisions? San Francisco is often sort of derided in the rest of the country as, San Francisco values, we're a bunch of wackos and stuff like that. But to me, it's paradise. So,
Well,
stop
first
there.
of all, it resonates. Mexico City is a huge mega region. It's one of the biggest in the world. Boston, Washington, San Francisco have high concentrations of skill, so it makes sense. The other thing, I was going to say, when you said you live in the city, some of my critics who were vicious said, Florida has Silicon Valley all wrong because you don't exist. Everyone who works in Silicon Valley moved here to avoid San Francisco. The engineers and the techies live in the valley. The crazies, their words, live in San Francisco. And I remember I blogged about this. Well, so first thing when I read about the Google bus, I'm like, they can't be right if Google is running a bus to San Francisco because it has employees that live there. And one of the things I'd love to look at is actually a map. And I'd love it if you guys could show it, a map of where your people live. But I think in one of the things I worry about in the book is this divide in our country, which I think you see in the election. I really think you see this in the election. With this concentration of talent, with this concentration of skill, with this concentration of wealth in a San Francisco Bay Area. And then the rest, and in New York, and in Boston, and in Washington, and in Austin, as the rest of the country falls further and further behind, and as younger people from those parts of the country want to move here, what happens is instead of people thinking about their economic circumstance, they make that calculation that my critic made. Oh my God, San Francisco is undermining family values. It's where the yuppies, the sophistos, the immigrants, the libertine young people partying all night, gays and lesbians. And then you get this terrible backlash. And I think what we have in America today is not only cultural backlash and a political polarization, I think it's an economic war, an economic class war. And I've actually been looking at this in great detail. And one of the things the book says is we've got to figure out a way to lift up and give more opportunity to the people outside these areas, because if they don't get more opportunity, they're just going to get madder and madder and madder at us. And it really worries me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm going to put on a regional policymaker hat for a second. And you mentioned this idea of take research university, add venture capital, and shake vigorously, which makes me think about degree of causality and path dependency.
That's good.
So I haven't been able to frame a better question than that, so I'm just going to ask you to comment on both of those.
Yeah, and I think partly I love that joke about take a research university, add venture capital, and shake vigorously, because 99% of the places that have tried that have completely failed. And I think what we're beginning to understand, in at least our research, and there's great resistance to this, because most people want the easy path. Most people want the path that says, I have a great research university, I can provide some venture capital, I can encourage some people to spin off companies, and I'm going to blossom. I think what my research is suggesting is that the critical element in that, and I don't know if it's causal, these might be correlative, because social phenomenon and economic phenomenon are so complex. And I think I'm a big believer in trying to find causal relationships in social science, but it's very hard. It is really hard. I think the association that matters is the fact that there are certain places which have research universities, but have the kind of environment that people want to stay in. You know, I'm sure some of you went to universities where you felt excited by the university, but sort of the community didn't entice you. And I think what was different about the Bay Area is that the community enticed people to hang around. And look at Austin, Texas. People tell you this all the time. Even if I have to drive a cab and I have to work in a coffee shop, I want to stay there because I can be me. And I think this ability of people to connect with their community and feel like they can be themselves and self-express is a critical factor. So the fact that the Bay Area was so open-minded is a third leg of that triangle. Great university, abundant venture capital, lots of entrepreneurship, but also a generally open-minded community. And that's the one that most regional policymakers are terrified of. You know why? Because if they become more open-minded, they're going to get voted out of office. I mean, it makes perfect sense. The more you invite interesting, smart, intelligent, creative people around you, the more they're going to demand something from the community. So I think, in fact, there's a fear factor which paralyzes many communities and locks them into the old, outmoded ways, which they continue down that path and it doesn't work.
Yeah. Thanks for your insight on the Google shuttle. In your research, have you gathered any other insights about how people deal with the dilemma of where they want to live being different from where they want to work in their commute patterns, et cetera?
Well, that's the point of the book, right? The point of the book says that you have to be aware of this trade-off, especially in these spiky centers like the Bay Area, where housing costs, because there's so much demand, are through the roof. So the book says you've got to be really, really aware of that trade-off. And you've got to say, okay, How am I going to balance career against my lifestyle needs, my family, the need to meet people? One of the things we know, and this is not my research, but one of the things the brilliant happiness researchers have concluded is one of the things that makes us least happy is a long commute. A commute over 20 minutes. There is a consensus, if there's one consensus in this literature, is a commute over 20 minutes makes us very, very unhappy. So I think you just have to be, one of the things the research says is be aware of that. Now, if you're on a bus or a train and you can do other things and the commute doesn't bother you, that's your own personal choice. But if you're stuck in a car and in traffic, just be aware that the research says that's a big trade-off, and it may be worth it to spend more money. I mean, one of the things the book says is look at your life. It may be worth it to spend more money to live close in. The other thing the book says, and I just want to point this out more on housing, don't look at housing affordability as the key factor. Look at how that, because it's the biggest investment decision most of us make in our life, look at the long-run performance of those investments. Housing may be cheap in an area because it's never going to appreciate. And one of the things the book says is when you're thinking about a housing investment, even if it seems like a stretch, if you're looking at a place that has seen solid, like if we had bought a house in Cincinnati versus San Francisco in 1950, the house in Cincinnati might have doubled. The house in San Francisco might have gone up 10 or 20 times. And we have that, the actual facts and figures in the book. But the trade-off there and what you spend your money on balancing happiness is an individual decision. Find the best fit for you, and the book tries to give some advice there. Thank you. So there's one more question, and then we can take some offline.
Professor Florida, thanks for the great talk. U.S. offers a great sampling ground for you because there is a large diversity, there is a democratic government, elections mean a lot. Outside the more democratic content, looking at the countries like the post-Soviet Union space, China, South America, how does your model treat the conditions when you have a bureaucratic capital that drags all of the resources and produces everything from matches to nuclear arms or something?
Yeah, that is a great question. We have the first data, and this is our job at our new institute, the Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto. We want to collect that data because no one collects it. So the first thing we did was the mega region data, and I want to mention this for example. The one thing we found is if you think the United States has an uneven geography, is spiky with centers like San Francisco and New York and Boston. If you look at the emerging economies, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, they are much more spiky and uneven than we are. In China, in India, we are not competing with countries. We're competing with 2 mega regions in those countries, which have literally sucked in all the talent. And I'll end on a comment because this really troubles me. And I think this needs a global solution. In addition to climate change and other issues, this is the one I think that's the biggest. And you and I can talk a little bit more later. I asked my Chinese student about this. When we have a paper on China, and we looked at this concentration. We know about Moscow sucking in all of the energy and talent in the former Eastern country, former Soviet Union. And I asked him, what do you think of this? And he said, you know what, Professor Florida, I'm really worried. He said, in Shanghai, and I want to be respectful of you, and I know I'm just young, he said, frankly, I live in a better socioeconomic condition than you and your family do. He said, but the people outside of Shanghai, his words, live in pre-civilized conditions. That's the level of economic inequality. And my hunch is that it's not like those countries are becoming more like the United States. My hunch is the concentrating force, the clustering force, the thing that I talked about, concentrating work and job and career, is actually making our world far more concentrated. And the advanced countries are coming to look more like the emerging economies instead of vice versa. One of the biggest issues facing the world today, we have to get over this methodology that the world is flat, that globalization lets everyone plug and play. Because in point of fact, the world is becoming much more uneven. And whether you look at terrorism in the Middle East, rural riots in China, the problems of immigrant adaptation in the Netherlands, in Denmark, riots in France, or our own political polarization in this campaign, I think the real key of that lies in this incredible overlap of economic and wealth concentration and geographic concentration. Again, thanks for your time. The website is HoosierCity.com or CreativeClass.com, and I look forward to talking with you guys, and I look forward to being able to interact with you in the future. So thanks so much. Thank you.